Welcome everyone to Epoch Philosophy, just in podcast form. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, podcast, everything at large at Epoch Philosophy as a whole. Consider pledging a couple dollars a month to help keep this entire project alive and get access to some really cool perks like early access to videos, voting on future videos, Discord access, editing tutorials, and the like. Without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, everyone, I am here with Victor from the PillPod. Victor, for anyone who doesn't know you, I'm sure most of them do. You want to introduce yourself, man?
Yeah, sure. I'm Victor. I'm one of the four people on the Plastic Pills podcast, the PillPod. And I'm also a PhD student in my fifth year at the University of Toronto in political theory, in the political science department. And yeah, that's me basically.
Sick. So, I mean, like I say like if you don't know Victor, but I assume everyone does because you've been on a handful of streams. You had your girlfriend Michelle on stream one time. That was awesome.
Yeah, that was fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right,
Are you
man.
still doing those streams, by the way, much or not?
Yeah.
Much
So I still definitely stream. I just have to be more selective. I figured doing like podcast and then focusing on videos and then going back and forth, it would allow me a more structured way to do content. Streaming is just one of those really weird elastic things that kind of like it's kind of hard to explain, but it's when it's harder to make content in stream form because it's very like whim, it's on a whim.
Yeah.
And podcasts and videos are a lot easier to plan. So yeah, I still do them. It's just farther in between now.
Yeah, cool. And how's the podcast been going? I was glad to see you were doing one. It's been going pretty well, or?
Pretty well, yeah. I kind of, I'm looking at podcasts as something very supplementary for people who really enjoy podcasts. I actually really, I listen to them here and there, but I'm not a big podcast person, but I know a lot of people are. And I know it's an easy and efficient way for people to sort of, I guess, explore things outside of video, right? So like whatever your hobby or interests are, sometimes people don't have time to sit and watch a video, and I understand that and I respect that. So I figured hopefully we could, I could at least do what I do in video form, but make it a little bit more accessible into podcast form.
Yeah. No, totally. That makes sense.
Cool. So yeah, so we were just talking about it. We are how many weeks out from like the whole Afghanistan debacle and stuff like that. So I figured, like I was telling you before, I was going to recruit you because you're the politics man, such as myself. I was going to recruit you to talk about Afghanistan. And even though you said your research doesn't really go into international relations, ironically, I actually thought that was good. I forgot to tell you that. Like I don't think I want to, with my experience, talking or like sort of working with like an education, like working with and talking to other international relations students, about 80% of the time, it's an interesting experience, and I'm not a big fan of international relations. Like it gets pretty rough real quick. It's very I don't know. It's like it's almost like international relations has been able to sublimate very violent and like militaristic things under the abstract guise of like expertise. We can figure this sort of issue out because I am an international relations student, or I took this class on this and this and this and that, and it's usually there's a very it's pretty far in the way from any sort of ethical imperative and how to do like international relations. It's really weird. I'm not a big fan.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think it's one of the sort of like 4 or 5 main kind of subfields in political science, and like. When I went into my PhD, I could have chosen to do IR as kind of like my second field, but of course I was going to do political theory. I mean, that was what I was there to do. But I ended up choosing. At University of Toronto, they have like public policy, which is kind of like comparative politics, except it just focuses on like the policy process. Just because I thought, I'm a theory student, and like what's going to be a nice, like practical sounding counterbalance to theory, public policy. So that's kind of why I picked it. But yeah, IR was like, some people said that maybe I should choose IR because there is like also a lot of theory in IR. I don't know how many IR classes you took. I know people talk about like how there's those different kind of schools of thought, and like there's even Marxist approaches to IR, right? Which is like and like there's like feminist IR, I think. So like there's different, and like I think there's a lot of Rawls. Like Rawls might be kind of a figure because he wrote a book, The Law of the Peoples. But yeah, like I think the other thing was I heard that the reading list for the international relations core course was also like way longer. So I was like, well, I'm not going to do that one.
Yeah, good idea. No, there. I was actually going to add that as well. There is a lot of theory with international relations, and the one I think I briefly brought it up with you. The one that really came to mind, and I always think about when there's some weird debacle, right? Like any weird debacle that happens globally or anything like that. It always makes me think that like you can almost like there's discourse about this certain situation with texts that are super fucking old, and I think about The Prince from Machiavelli all the time whenever it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, like I mean, the entire Afghan situation, you know, it's happened tons of times, maybe in slightly different contexts, but I always do think back to sort of the original early foundations of political theory, and it almost always touches on sort of the goal of foreign policy and stuff like that, right? So I've personally read The Prince, and Machiavelli goes into that a lot. The other one that Locke will talk about it. Rousseau, The Social Contract. People think the social contract they wouldn't expect it. I didn't expect it to go heavy into that, but it absolutely does. So yeah, there's a lot of Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. The one thing that's all good. The one thing that's really kind of interesting, I guess, about IR is like, because in politics, we're always trying to think about like legitimate uses of power and also like legitimate authority and like authority in general and like what gives something stability and authority. And I guess the interesting thing about IR is just that like there's kind of a puzzle about like now that we're in a more globalized world, like what actually grounds like stability, because there's no world government, right? So there's just like, and that's I think where like maybe IR realism is like one of the main theoretical frameworks that basically just like argues that like each individual country is trying to like get the best deal for itself. And like they're purely self-interested, and then there's like other kinds. I forget what all the schools of thought are named, but like I guess like from a sort of like a intellectual perspective, like it is an interesting sort of puzzle to think about like why, like because it seems like nominally anarchistic, at least the relationship between states, because there's like not anything that is actually overriding it, but like they roughly managed to like not. Well, I mean, I guess there has been a lot of wars, so like I guess it's debatable like how actually like stable the world situation is. But yeah, there's definitely some interesting stuff.
Right. No, you kind of brought up how like nominally like anarchist it sort of is and can be. And I think that's actually kind of foundational to international relations. That's I've taken a couple classes on it, and that's kind of been the major core ethos that a lot of like my professors kind of said through that. Like I can't remember. I think like the actual term for that is like zero-sum theory when it comes to international relations. It's just that like everything's a zero-sum game. You take something from someone, and you gain something, it's taken from someone else, and that every foreign body has to operate within that logic. I personally don't. So it's not like I don't like that, obviously, right? Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know if I would necessarily debate that, right? Like, maybe that is true. That sounds kind of correct. I think that's sort of where my problem with international relations lie, is that they almost, what I noticed this class, and people who are into international relations, they almost just like sort of accept that notion in the way that like, it's just like, oh, that's the way it is, so we have to practice foreign policy within those confines. I really don't like that. I think that any sort of field that doesn't constantly try to push their very boundaries on how they do things, it's not good. And that's been, again, too, my problem with fields such as political science. And that's why I like theories, because theory is always trying to push the bounds on how things are approached. I think that's the thing. Like, if in international relations it is a zero-sum game, again, if we're interested in pushing boundaries, I would be very interested in trying to find a way to escape a zero-sum boundary on how we do foreign policy. But I think even asking that question, you're just not going to get any, like, the international relations students would look at you like you're stupid. They have no idea how to approach what you just said. That's at least my experience. So.
Yeah, totally. And I guess to sort of bring it to the Afghanistan topic, I think, one of the like theories that in IR that I've heard like some of my colleagues talk about. But I think it's maybe like going a bit out of vogue with like the rise of China. But like there was always the idea of like the global hegemon, like that's the thing, which is the United States, obviously, and like that's basically like the thing that allows for a somewhat quasi stable environment, because you have one country that's just so much stronger than another one, and it is broadly trying, like, based on liberal democratic values, maybe less and less so, but like that's the original idea of America. So it was like that's like the world police, the thing that governs, the thing that uses that has like almost a monopoly of force. And I guess like, you know, and then the decision to enter into Afghanistan, I guess was, well, I mean, I guess there's a lot of factors. I mean, was there, I mean, I'm old enough to remember like 9/11 and then like the response to it. And like, I sometimes wonder whether or not, if something similar happened today, like, would they actually like go in guns blazing like they did back then?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know either. Yeah, I'm young. I think a lot of people don't realize I'm actually 24 years old, but I do actually vaguely remember like sort of the events of 9/11, and I remember my mom crying. I remember, and then I also remember something else. Things of my mom watching TV and crying. There was two events. One was 9/11. Two, the second was the spaceship exploding in the air. I can't remember what that was in the early 2000s.
The Columbia.
Yeah, I think that's what it was. But those two times are the only thing I kind of remember. I didn't understand the context whatsoever, other than that it was very sad and a lot of people died. But no, on the question of like, would it happen today? Would we do the same thing? I don't know, man. And I want to say that for every tragedy and foreign policy blunder or any sort of political blunder, you get enough distance and time from it. It's like it's bound to almost repeat again. There's a repetition to how these things happen, and I say that, but yet we haven't had another world war in a very long time. And I'm one of the few people, when talking about world wars and if there will be one again, I'm not convinced that we're going to have another World War III that's going to be way bloodier than World War II. I really am. I'm actually, call me an optimist, I'm not convinced of that, but a lot of people are. But nonetheless, that seems to be a pretty big pattern. I wouldn't be shocked if we got into another quote unquote forever war. Yeah.
It's hard to, I mean, I do feel like there's been this attitude change, and to some extent, like Trump was, I think, part of this, where like in the United States, you know, you went from like sort of the neoconservatives like Bush and Cheney and those who really liked this idea that I was kind of mentioning earlier, with like America being the global hegemon and kind of being like the world's police force and like spreading liberal democratic values or whatever. And also at the same time, using that clearly to secure more American interests. But I think that there's been sort of like a shift towards isolationism a little bit, or like people seem to be like more interested in that or more open to this idea of isolationism on both. I mean, I guess the left was, I wouldn't call them isolationists, but like maybe more skeptical of entering in and intervening in other countries. But it seems like the right more and more is like really like, we need to stop intervening and stuff. So I feel like there's just like very little appetite, at least right now. But you're right. It's like, who knows, with enough time going by, like, I guess anything could happen. But I mean, I don't know. You were mentioning like the debacle. And I guess when you say the debacle in Afghanistan, like, are you referring to like the whole thing, or just like recent events of like pulling out and stuff?
Well, certainly I would claim that Afghanistan itself is a whole debacle, but nonetheless, yeah, primarily I was referring to like the recent events, right? Us leaving and Joe Biden failing to direct our military in the right way and being a leader and all that fun. I probably like media regurgitated stuff. Yeah. I guess I suppose, you know, being a politics guy and being sort of a left winger, I obviously am very much glad that we are out. But I'm curious to see if there is any qualms or something that you might have a perspective that might go against that, or if you're there as well.
Well, I definitely think that they were there for way too long, and that like they should have gotten out earlier. And overall, I think it's a good thing that they left. But in terms of like how Joe Biden handled it, like I think it's true that it could have been handled better. But at the same time, like I think I forget where I heard this, but like there were certain incentive pressures at the time. So like the argument that I heard that I found somewhat persuasive is like, look, they have to kind of pretend that everything's fine in order to leave, because if they say like everything's terrible and it's going to be a nightmare and the Taliban's going to like take over right away, then like why are they leaving? Like,
yeah.
So like if they admit that from the beginning and they're like, okay, we need to evacuate everybody right now because this is a hellhole and it's going to get really, really bad. So like, let's get everybody out of here. That would be them saying, look, it's terrible. And then people would be like, well, if it's that terrible, why are you leaving like right now? So, right. So it's like, I don't know if that's totally like, maybe there's a counter argument to that, but I remember thinking like, yeah, it's true. Like internally, like they kind of had to pretend that everything was like kind of manageable and under control in order to like justify sort of like rhetorically and politically leaving. And it's like, is that like a good excuse? Like, it's not really a good excuse necessarily, but like, I guess it gives maybe a different perspective on like why it went so badly. Like at least in explaining it, not so much justifying it, but because I think like kind of from the outside, when I initially heard the story, I was like, well, why did Biden like not, like why would he not do that? Like it almost made zero sense. But then when I heard this other explanation, well, I was like, yeah, that's kind of true. Like you have to kind of like, in order to justify like rhetorically to just like leave, they have to kind of like play this sort of charade where things are under control, right? If that makes sense.
Well, that's certainly how the sort of rhetorical politics go, right? With administrations and that kind of stuff. I actually would probably reverse that position, though. I almost feel like because it's really bad right now is the direct reason why we should leave, ironically. And it's because the bad, quote unquote, the Taliban taking power was really pretty much, I mean, I think it's almost unanimous. I don't even want to say in my opinion, because I don't even know if this is like up to opinion anymore, but like foreign occupation like bolstered Taliban support, and it did all of these things to just completely embolden them. And it's, I think maybe there might be some sort of, for people who are really anti-war and really sick of sort of the idea of global American empire, they might kind of be a little bit more excusatory. They might excuse the Taliban more so, but the Taliban's fucking horrible, right? Like they're fucking horrendous. They're already like, and it's not just fucking US propaganda. Like they're already like backtracking on promises not to execute former like, Afghan, military members and stuff like that. They're terrible, but I think that because things are at the worst point that they are, that's the ultimate reason why we should ironically leave. And I think that it makes perfect sense that someone like Joe Biden would play quote unquote rhetorical politics with that positioning and pretend that everything's good. I suppose it's just a big ask. I would really, not that it would really mean anything. Politicians aren't all that powerful, like as mere individuals, but nonetheless, I guess it would have been a little bit refreshing to see sort of maybe someone like Joe Biden say that, like, hey, like shit's really bad and stuff in Afghanistan's really, really bad, likely because of how long we've been there. Like before the United States was ever in Afghanistan, the Taliban was weaker than what it's at now. And it's because of this very idea that's why we should leave. But I think there's a sort of distrust with politicians to ever think that normal people can think within that sort of mode of I want to say almost dialectical or like paradoxical logic of like, look, like being able to reverse things and look at it in a different perspective. It's just that there's this in politics, you got to assume everyone's fucking stupid and you got to use the very core binary logic at hand. I would have appreciated if any administration would do something like that, but now they're playing rhetorical politics,
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the type of rhetorical politics, like I mean, what you said like resonates with me, and I think that it would be really refreshing to see to just have Joe Biden. And I think you're right about like the fact that there's like the rhetoric has to kind of assume that everyone's an idiot, but I would add a little bit of a nuance to that it's not that like the type of idiot, and maybe it's not even idiocy, but it's like I feel like right now there's like this overwhelming like almost need for politicians to seem like they are pro-humanitarian, like they have to always play this sort of like humanitarian rhetoric all the time. So like so here's what Joe Biden, to be like real with us, would have had to say. And I think it's just like from a political strategic perspective or rhetorical perspective, I feel like it's a really tough pill for him to swallow. I think it's after I say what I mean, it'll be interesting to consider whether or not we think like the public could have handled this. Like, but like, I think what he would have had to say would have been like, look, like it's really bad. It's going to get out of control. Like, we don't really want to be here anymore. Like, people are going to die. Like, women are going to like lose their rights. And like, you know, like the little semblance of sort of like more like sort of equality and sort of like values that we care about, like they're only sort of there because we're there, and we're going to leave now. So like that's going to end, and a bunch of people are going to die, and a bunch of people are going to lose their rights. But like, we're just going to leave because it's a shit show right now. Right. Like, so the problem is like admitting that you have to kind of go against this imperative to sound like a humanitarian, or at least be pro-humanitarian values. And then I guess the question, as I was saying before, is like, could the public handle hearing that basically truth? Right. I don't know.
My sort of right. No. Those are all good points. I want to say in my heart, yes, the public can handle that. There's also, and I might actually push further with that idea too, is that we the way sort of politics happens, quote unquote, it comes from a position where people sort of are sheeple. And that presupposition is almost founded on everything in politics, right? That people are just subjects, and these subjects are sort of just determined through culture and all these things that they're doing, and they just go about their job and their life. I actually I very deeply reject that. Someone who points a lot of that out very well in my mind is someone like Zizek. This is like the core 21st century subject is one of skepticism and cynicism. It's the opposite of what we'd expect. So I think that, and maybe that's a new development. Maybe that wasn't always the case. But I think today we could very well make the argument, as far as like subjects who live in a society, I think we're rather pretty skeptical. And so, and I think that's precisely why people like Trump and people like Bernie Sanders were a bit more popular.
Appealing.
But yeah, appealing because they sort of honed in on this sort of honesty and reversal of how politics typically goes as normal. So
yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. And in fact, I think that like, if there's someone who could have said what I just like earlier proposed, it would have been Trump. Like Trump would have been like, yeah, it's bad. But like, and it's funny because like, maybe I would have been like, on that point, I would have been like, yeah, he's right. Like, cause he would have said something like, that's not our problem. Like, sorry. Like, we were there, we put in like $1 trillion or however many it was. And like, it sucks, but this is not our problem. And like, to some extent, I mean, he would put it in that kind of, really like, you know, maybe crueler way than necessary, because like, you know, it's not like part of the problem is also potentially caused by the United States. So like, maybe arguably it's like partially I mean, I don't know. That's like a kind of separate question. But.
I think that's where, if we settle on the argumentation to leave Afghanistan being that it's not our problem, or that you know, all of these things, I think that's almost like stopping, like we're stopping too quick there as far as reasons go. I think it's precisely that it is our problem, it is our fault, and that's precisely why we should leave, right? Like it is our fault that this stuff is happening in so many ways, and thus we should end this cycle of sort of foreign policy that causes this to come to fruition. I think that's how we should really look at a lot of future issues regarding foreign policy. I think that there is a sort of simplistic logic used in that regard, and I think maybe trying to break that mold might allow us to think a little bit more specifically and a little bit more clearly regarding how these events happen. Because I like truly, like it's like hard to understate how crazy it is that, you know, the Taliban is more powerful after a 20-year war. Like I think that's like that's unfathomable to me in so many ways. Like I mean, of course it makes sense, right? They in many ways probably radicalized groups of people. There was another form of weird cultural suppression with like a puppet government from the United States being in power in Afghanistan. I understand those things, yet at the same time, there is such a large like national defense of that with like neoconservatives in the early 2000s to they're like, oh, we're going to fix this. It's still crazy to me. Like, I feel like that's a very big deal, and it's still relatively not talked about how like a lot of the Taliban being in power is precisely because of us, right? A really interesting, weird paradox, and I think that's in many ways reminds me of like Vietnam, right? Like same thing with Vietnam. Arguably, the NVA had more support after the Vietnam War, and I'm hoping that with enough historical examples such as this coming on, that we can probably try to end this really violent tradition of just occupation in other places, right? Almost the best way to describe it in some regards is like neocolonialism. I think that that's the best way, at least I can look at it, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I was thinking before how like the almost the problem with the approach is like that. Well, that's kind of the interesting thing about neocolonialism. Actually, is like that it's almost like the worst of both worlds. Like not that not that true
100%.
colonialism like is realistic, but like but like to some extent, like if we really care about like these sort of like whatever our Western humanitarian values and like women's rights and all these things that we care about, like if like we were serious about that, in some ways like the best approach would have been real colonialism. Like make it the 51st state, like make Afghanistan an American state and like go all in. Obviously that's not realistic, and like no one would have supported that, but in some way, but then it's like instead we're like we have these half measures where it's like, okay, we're kind of occupying this country, and then like we're sort of trying to fund schools like in a half-assed way to push to give women and whatever minorities and like whatever category we can think of like more rights, but it's like not really like doing it. It's just like, and then as soon as you leave, it's like everything just goes back. So it's kind of funny that way.
No, that's 100%. That's tragic. That's a very good point. That it's like what we're doing is sort of very like half measured stuff. It like ironically, as horrible as like colonialism is, raw colonialism probably would have even been a more favorable like thing for even the people of Afghanistan. That's a really good point. But I think that like almost can visualize why, like how in my mind how fucking horrible like our current approach is. I also find that like with these large scale debacles, like the one of the longest wars ever, the longest war in US history, with this failing, I'm wondering what you think. I'm kind of in a position that we are kind of like entering in a sort of accelerated decline of American empire. Not to say that like the empire is going to fall, right? It's going to be like Roman collapse. But I really think that like this is it. Like I think for the United States, as of now, I think we've officially hit the point where the United States being the absolute powerhouse, it's done, man. I think it's absolutely done at this point. I think China has probably won the day. I think that it's very. I think that like Afghanistan is a really good sort of symbolic signal of that happening. I'm curious to what you think, like how to look at sort of how geopolitics are going to be approached in the future, given that the United States was the global baseline of power.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because like on sort of it's tough because I think like what America still is so dominant on, well, it's true like sort of economically, China is rising for sure, and I'm not sure if it is already or it's really close to being like the same size overall as the American economy. Maybe it passed it a little bit. I'm not actually sure, but I know it's like projected to pass the US size soon, or maybe it already has. But I think like America is still so culturally dominant.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, China is like Chinese people growing up in middle class, like they're interested in American culture. Like they're interested in hamburgers and like, whatever America is into, like the food, like movies, Hollywood, like, so, it's hard to, I'm like a little bit more skeptical that like the empire is in decline. Like it is to some extent, like economically, like the numbers, but like the cultural footprint that's been left behind. I mean, in some ways, like everybody lives in America, culturally, like with YouTube, especially now, and like globalization, like internet communication. I mean, there's people. Sometimes I think about, I'm not really into contemporary hip hop. In fact, like I really don't like it. Even though when I was younger, I used to really like hip hop. But so there's this one guy, Rich Brian. Have you heard of him?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, so what I find interesting about him is like when you see him talk, he has no accent, but he's from Jakarta, Indonesia.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And why does he have no accent?
I've noticed that.
Because he watched YouTube.
Oh.
He like grew up watching American YouTube and taught himself how to speak like American English.
Wow.
And it's like that sort of tells you like the sort of cultural pull of America. It's just so strong. It's like the whole world is becoming like vaguely Americanized. So yeah, I mean, so I don't know. It's just I think it's changing its form.
Right.
The American empire, and like it's also possible that, I mean, some other cultural superpower will rise up, but it just feels like I don't know if there's any sort of real contender for that sort of like it almost feels like the moment that the internet was invented, it's like whoever was the cultural superpower at that point would just like spread their culture would just spread everywhere because of the internet. And like I feel like just America was the cultural superpower at the time of the internet, and now it's just like everywhere. I don't know.
No, dude, no. I think those are all very good points. I've actually kind of thought exactly what you have thought, and I think that's ironically a lot of my almost a lot of my distant cynicism with China is precisely what you're saying. They're going about because you're completely right. I've actually always thought that the split between cultural sort of order and then like economic orders. They're very separate in a lot of ways, and it's like China's definitely winning on the economic scale. But what I've noticed is like I've ironically thought like a lot of China's decisions regarding culture stuff is actually so insanely stupid, and it's not going to work. I don't know if you saw that they're trying to ban effeminate men. And that's
I didn't hear about that.
Yeah, and like media and culture. And that's part of it, and that's horrible and it's stupid. No one can defend that. But and part of it also is they want to ban sort of showcasing like a materialism on camera, like showcasing like how rich you are. They kind of want to put that at a distance, and I don't think that's a little bit more virtuous. Well, I mean that is a little bit more, yeah. But like banning effeminate men and sort of worrying about a sort of demasculinization of people in China, that's all pretty horrible shit, and that's not going to help them win stuff. They've also banned like the use of video game time for people. Have you for children? Have you read about that at all lately?
No. What's that? Wait, I feel like maybe I saw someone talk about it, but I didn't know the details, and I don't know like how that's going to be implemented. Do you know? Because I'd be really curious.
Yeah, I do. So I think children can play about 3 hours of video games a week in China now. And one of the largest, and they're doing it actually through private corporations, although what's private and public in China is a little bit it's not very clear. But nonetheless, they're forcing the hand of the largest gaming corporation, Tencent Games, to develop sort of like facial recognition, and you have to like scan your face before you play video games. And so you have to scan your face. I believe like if you're an adult, like there is no limitation on how long you can play, I believe. But if you're a child and they have your information, like you're not going to be able to log on. And they're ironically using gaming platforms, they're regulating them and saying you have to implement a tool where you sign on and you do this. It's really stupid, right? If you want to be a sort of cultural powerhouse, if you want to be the quote unquote global hegemony, and I think it's ridiculously dumb. China's definitely. So is
this I'm guessing this is for online games, or does this apply to like single player?
I think every single game. I think I know.
That's weird.
It's bizarre. It really is bizarre. I think that's ironically, it kind of showcases the mass difference that sort of centralized bureaucratic quote unquote existing socialism has and always has been in sort of like the 20th century. One of the largest problems is the very distance from the literal people. Like I've kind of always said that the United States, I've always kind of thought the United States has always been a lot closer to their contemporary subjects, right? They're trickier, right? So in the United States, to control subjects, a lot of critical theorists have talked about this, right? Like you give the aura of distance, but in understanding the aura of distance and allowing a sort of perceived freedom, you have to understand people's impulses, their desires, and stuff like that. And at least in the USSR and China, that hasn't really, on a political level, that philosophy hasn't really been implemented. It's actually a lot more direct, right? It's like this sort of the best way to describe it in many regards is a social totalitarianism, and I know it's going to get me fucking in trouble, but that's really their approach, is just to be cut and dry about how to deal with sort of these issues. And it's like right now it's just mass sort of I think, like you said, a sort of cultural regulation. I think they're going about it the wrong way if they want to really capture the hearts and minds of a future global order past the United States.
Yeah, no, totally. I think it's interesting. You're kind of reminding me of a conversation I had with one of my good friends. He's actually doing his PhD in philosophy in University of Ottawa, and he was visiting. He used to live in Toronto, and he tends to have like sort of, I wouldn't say reactionary views, but he's more inclined towards thinking about like the consequences of things and like the dangers of new things, and like he likes to think about also the value of like hanging on to older things, and like tends to just be like a bit skeptical of like changes, and always like, and I argue with him sometimes about like looking at the negatives. And we were having a conversation about technology and tyranny. And he was kind of saying like, like technology creates all these new opportunities for tyranny. And like, cause he was trying to say that like, and I think to some extent, like it's true that it creates more opportunities for tyranny. And in some ways we can see China like trying to do that, right? Like the internet's like pretty controlled. Right. But I was kind of arguing what you were just arguing, which is like, well, it's true that they can try to do these things, but like, I think that one of the things about technology is it also creates, like every time you create like a pathway of tyranny, I think like technologies also can be like used for the opposite direction, right? So it's like, so I was kind of trying to argue that it's kind of like neutral, because it just creates both. Like I mean, look at the Arab Spring, right? They like use technology to try to fight against against tyrannical regimes, and like you can try, but like, and in China you can use like VPNs, you can get around the shit, right? And it's like maybe so far so good, like they're managing to use it, but we'll see. But I actually think that I agree with you. At least I'm reading between the lines of what you said. Like, I think their attempts to control things the way that they're doing with the technology is going to fail eventually.
Right. And I think a lot of people will misunderstand the idea, like the position that the conclusions that you could come to with the sort of philosophy that Western countries do use this sort of distance. I actually, like, if you really want to tally things up, this might be a sort of debate for another time, but if you want to define quote unquote totalitarianism, and it's if you want to define what it would mean for like control and power, I want to say like Western countries are way fucking better at it than any Eastern country ever has been. And it happens through distance, it happens through like perceived notions of like freedom, and especially negative liberty and these kind of things. It allows an almost ironically sub-pacified subject. And like and that's why like I kind of argue it's like, there's a lot of stupid ideas on how we should designate like Eastern countries. Are they totalitarian? It's like, well, in many ways, absolutely. But it's like, so are Western countries, and in different contexts. And then there's a lot
very different.
Yeah, there's a lot. They happen to do things very differently. But I think the United States and Western countries are so much better at it. Like it's so clear that they are so much more intelligent on how to hone in on desire. It's not even funny. That's why I really kind of I kind of argue. Well, I know you have I'm sure you just laugh at the insane, stupid shit a lot of like online quote unquote MLs, Marxist Leninists will say regarding Eastern countries. Like it is the most stupid thing, because it's like, if anything, like I think that like you're a lot of like what happens is like a fetish towards countries like China or the USSR who did things very, very dumb. And I'm not like they did things in the most stupid ways in many regards. Granted, there I leave some large footnotes there that there's a lot of foreign political pressure and stuff like that, right? Like nothing the USSR ever could do wasn't like a sort of reaction against, I want to say like what's the term I'm looking for? Antagonism against the East, like the United States is a very, very, I want to say almost like violent power against any sort of ideological push past capitalism, and that's very real. But I think it's like we're at the point, like if you think repeating the same 20th century sort of ideas on how to move past these things within context of quote unquote existing socialism, it's really mind-bogglingly dumb to me. It's very simplistic.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting about sort of like the type of power and control that's exerted in Western countries versus like kind of in China, because I think like you're right that like, and I was going to kind of say like that maybe there's like nothing that's more likely to like wake up a population to like actually change than like if you're actually like applying overt and explicit tyrannical power.
Right.
Like, or at least that's like a lot more dangerous, but like, that's why like the sort of American Western context, it's like the types of influences and the way that their desire, as you said, is sort of like manipulated. Or I don't know. Did you see the Bo Burnham special, the Inside on Netflix?
I did not. I really should, but everyone kind of raves about it. I should.
It was great. There's just a part when he's kind of like in between like his comedy bits. He's just like talking about like how maybe like letting like, I think he says salamanders in Silicon Valley like profit off of the biochemical drama of our children, like wasn't a good idea. And so in some ways, like this is the sort of power that's exerted because desire is cultivated. But I guess the difference is like this sort of exertion of power and influence and the sort of like control society that we see as a result of this. It's not the result of like a centralized authority, like purposely trying to do something. I mean, maybe some people would think that it is, but that would seem like a little bit conspiratorial to me. But like to some extent, this is just like the spontaneous reaction of like just having a highly consumerist society where then people see like opportunities to, cultivate people's biochemical drama in their brains as
right
or whatever. And it's like, that's so like that produces a kind of outcome of sort of like control. But then I guess like the sort of more skeptical side in me like wonders, well, what does it mean to have like, what would a society look like that isn't like, because, if we think back to, I mean, neither of us was alive in like the 18th century or 17th century or like, but like, I don't know, like, is it possible to have a society where like people's biochemical drama isn't being cultivated by something? Like, I mean, I don't know. Like it's different. It does seem like we're in a functionally and like just different time where like our desires are being cultivated in these like very like in like sort of a cycle of like getting quick gratification all the time, where like in some ways we're getting these like highs more often. We're like, look at our phone, we get a little high because we see someone responded to some tweet. And like there's this kind of like feedback loop that's like a lot more kind of magnified and concentrated. It's like, so like, whereas in the past that wasn't the case, but they were influenced, I guess, by other things. Maybe that's the main difference. Maybe I've answered my own question. I don't know.
No, I mean, like, can we live in a world like I almost think with the conclusions and the results of the internet and mass new age media, can we live in a world where those results don't like we will always have those constant sort of chemical dumps, and that's how we structure like a new form of desire? I don't know. Like I would argue probably that we're at a point where there almost is no return from that sort of weird quasi hedonism, Do you think that that's maybe what I posed as like another way of sort of like the Marxist puzzle of like, how do you almost like create like a non-alienated subjectivity? Like, because maybe like this cycle of desire we're in is like a symptom of alienation. And then the other thought I had is also like on the PillPod, I was like forced to do some reading on Deleuze. I've never really read any Deleuze, and
I wonder if like Deleuze is trying to also locate that with his like this idea of like the desiring machine. I mean, you did a video on Deleuze. I don't know how well you know it, but like maybe that's what he's after, trying to find this kind of like way of honing desire in this like creative, free roaming way that isn't subject to these like sort of like influences.
So I haven't actually read a lot of D&G together. I've read a bit of actually like just Deleuze, but it was only his book on Spinoza. So I'm not exactly sure on like the whole anti-Oedipus sort of positioning and capitalism and schizophrenia. But I think that's right. I think that's roughly what Deleuze is interested in, is trying to find like newer kernels of desire or like moving past, I suppose the language he would use is re-territorializing certain things.
Right. Right.
Yeah, like I think you brought up like this there's a sort of new Marxist puzzle with it. I actually ironically think that like it depends on what you mean by Marxism, right? I think like I think core like traditional quote unquote Marxism isn't going to be good enough, right? Like I don't think we can understand these things like psychoanalysis was a very big thing. Like I think it can, as Marxist, right, we can be very, I mean, I don't even, despite like my identity, I don't even know if I consider myself a Marxist. Nonetheless, if I was a Marxist, it would be impossible to ignore. It would be impossible to ignore the sheer impact that psychoanalysis has had on sort of analyzing the subject in sociological context, not just individual context like you see in psychology or more ideological Western narratives of the self. So I think that like, I think what we're seeing with like neo quote unquote Marxism, like people like Zizek, critical theorists like Adorno, Horkheimer, that's where I think that sort of theoretical terrain is going to be the only possible sort of opening. I don't think that Lenin gives us too much like insight on, or even Marx himself, a little bit of Marx, a bit of Marx. But I think ironically we've almost reverted back to like a German idealism and how to like a bit. It's like a synthesized German idealism and like psychoanalysis as a way to understand newer like subjects, I guess. But I say that, and then you have Deleuze, who are very they're not structuralist, and I don't know. I don't
know what they are.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a very good question. I'm almost kind of thinking through it out loud. I think. Yeah, I think that's sort of the problem with Marxism, and almost sort of the simplistic beauty about it is that Marxism is incredibly good at analyzing how systems operate, right? So like you were saying that like the sort of quasi hedonism that we were talking about in Western countries, it wasn't like this wasn't like something people designed, right? That's a very Marxist critique of the system, right? That's the correct Marxist system to come by. People mistake. They think that like, oh, these people in power are controlling us. And like, no. That is not the Marxist critique. The Marxist critique is that these systems are in power. They are influencing in an almost deterministic way how we do things. And that's Marx's point regarding things like commodity fetishism, sort of things like I want to say social alienation, because in some ways, like everyone's alienated in many ways, right? It's not just the quote unquote bourgeoisie, right? You're looking at it way too simplistically. And that's the beauty, I think, the beauty, like simplicity that I absolutely love with Marx. But people almost try to, I think there's this sort of idea that like we can use the same sort of original theories set within Marxism and try to figure out how to approach newer things that are developing within mass media and culture, and I think that's where neo-Marxism comes in.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point about Marxism, about like not like sort of the systems, because it really is like the system that creates the incentive for companies in like Silicon Valley or whatever to create these things that like capture people's attention and like make them be on their phone all day. Actually, so a professor friend of mine told me, I never actually checked to verify whether this is true, but he told me that like in Silicon Valley, like in Palo Alto, in those cities, like all the public schools like don't allow, like are very strict, where the kids aren't allowed on their phones. And the reason why is because like the people who live there, the parents, work for Silicon Valley and know that they're designing the software to be highly addictive. So they are like, we don't want our kids on the shit that we designed, because we designed that shit to be like cocaine for kids, like just like addictive as hell.
I didn't know that. That's fucking disturbing. I don't like that one bit.
So like, but the point is, like, it's the system of, I guess, capital that created that incentive, right? Where like, and it's not so much that like there was a grand plan, but it's like all these things coming together where someone's like, well, I'm going to create this like app that like lets people communicate, and like people really like it, and then they design it to make it as easy to use and as appealing to use, because the more they use it, the more ad revenue they get. Mm-hmm. But like they're just thinking narrowly, right? Like they're not thinking necessarily about how this is going to like fit in with everything else in culture. So like, yeah, it's a different kind of control society or whatever than like what we were talking about before with like China trying to very overtly control people and influence people.
Exactly. That's 100% correct. I think that's a good like sort of jumping off like exit point for us, right? Because I think you're kind of running out of time now. That's right. Like I think if we are going to look at future global orders of power, it's not going to happen by way of sort of innately suppressing this desire like China's doing with their sort of philosophy with video games. I don't think that's going to work. And I think that we should also be careful when designating or like what we should call that sort of thing that China's doing. It's in many ways, it's not like what China's doing in some regards is like a sort of reversal of like it's almost like an altruism of some sorts, like a light because like they're being honest about what's going on, right? And when you reverse it, you look at like what's happening in Western cultures, it's a much more slippery sort of thing. And I think you brought up that like there's a thing you can rebel against, and I before we leave, I forgot to bring up like look at what happened in Hong Kong. I believe Hong Kong was the largest protest, like by numbers. I think like something like 1/3 of the population was involved in protests. Yeah. That is fucking crazy, but that's 100% correct. Like if you're a Hegelian in many regards, you're looking at what's going on there, and you're like China. Like, do you see like the sort of innate sort of dialectical reaction to what's going on? And I think it's like to sort of move past that would be the smart thing for China. But I think that's right. Like if we're looking at global power, international orders, it's not going to come from occupation, right? It's not going to come or like foreign occupation. It's not going to come from these sort of like innate social we are seeing, in China. So yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That was a fun conversation. We kind of started with Afghanistan and went to some other cool, interesting topics. But I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, thanks so much, dude. And like, I agree. I thought that was a lot of fun. Thank you again for coming on. I was gonna before we leave, I figured I'd ask you too. I'd actually really like to have at some point again you and Michelle on again. I thought that was really cool, and she could talk again even more in depth about what she's doing, any updates on her research and stuff if she's comfortable with that. I enjoyed talking to her. Yeah, no, for
sure. I'll tell her actually. About the reason I have to go is because she's got she's studying for her comprehensive exam in her PhD, so she had to read like 100 and something books, and so like we're doing a little quiz session right now but she's ready for sure. She's ready, but it's just like we have like a little date where I'm gonna quiz her. I've got like the cue cards to make sure she's got all her content, and then I'll let her know. I'm sure she'd love to come on.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Best of luck to her, dude. And again, thank you so much. I will, hopefully talk to you soon. Seriously, thank you.
Yeah, man, for sure. It was fun. It was just nice to catch up anyway too. So yeah, I was glad to come on.
Definitely.